Give me a moment with your friend. I've never been on trial for my thoughts before.
Welcome to the Only One Mic podcast called Rob Brooklyn J. Rob is in the building. How y'all doing, fellas?
What up?
All right, we got a special guest today, guys. Sahaj Sharda is going to come in here and talk to us about this whole College Cartel scandal thing. We want to know what's going on with that, brother. How you doing, Sahaj?
I'm good. How are you?
Doing well, brother. All right, now we're going to jump right into it. But before we do, we want to get a little bit of your background, because I know this College Cartel thing is deep. And January is coming up. A lot of people about to sign up for some new semesters. Some people getting accepted into colleges and things coming up. And I think that this is something that everybody needs to hear. So give us a little bit of background on yourselves. Tell the people who you are.
Sure. So I'm Sahaj. I'm a student right now at Columbia Law School. But my background is kind of interesting. You know, I'm probably like the least likely person to speak out against elite colleges. My grandfather was the first in his family to get an education and get a higher education. He eventually went on to get a PhD. And so he sort of set the culture in my family that education is sort of the silver bullet. This is how you uplift yourself and move forward and pursue social mobility. And so I'd always grown up with that cultural narrative that, you know, these institutions of higher learning, they're sort of like temples that we ought to worship, that we ought to respect, and that we ought to do our best to, you know, gain admission into. And so, you know, it was weird. Even when I was young already, you know, some of the realities in America started immediately to conflict with my, you know, ideas about what higher education should be and what I was told it would be. And so I'll tell you a quick story. When I was in high school, I encountered my first college admission scandal, and I was a junior, and there was a girl who's a year older than me, and her name was Sarah Kim. And this is something that's been covered in the media. But what happened was, she told everyone she got into both Harvard and Stanford. And my high school was, you know, a competitive suburban high school in Northern Virginia. Everyone, you know, was sort of pressuring each other on getting into the most prestigious colleges. And so there was a bit of a toxic culture, a lot of pressure on students to get admission into elite colleges. And so naturally, this girl, you know, felt quite proud of her accomplishments and decided to broadcast it quite loudly. Well, what happened was her family was South Korean of origin. And the South Korean press somehow heard about this girl getting into both of these very elite colleges. And so they came to her high school, all the way from South Korea, to come and cover the story. And that's when things started to go south, because as the media started to look more and more into the story, you know, they would stop high school students and ask if we knew the genius girl, as they dubbed her in the South Korean press. And as they looked more and more into the story, you know, some of the things didn't really line up. Eventually, both Harvard and Stanford had to come out in the press and say, we didn't accept this girl. So we don't know what she's talking about. And then what happened was even weirder, because we got an email. Everyone at this high school got an email from a quote unquote professor at Harvard, a math professor, who said, you know, I've heard some of these rumors going around at your high school. We're telling you right now she got in, so stop spreading these rumors. And everyone at the school thought that was so weird. Well, what happened was this girl had somehow hacked Harvard to send this email out to her school. And so it was this weird runaway sort of toxic situation where she'd felt so much pressure initially that she'd come up with this lie. And once she told it, it'd gotten too big. It'd gotten out of her control. And she had to keep lying. Eventually, her parents had to come out in the press and apologize. You know, it became a huge deal. I think she ended up doing something else for college. But, you know, that's the sort of thing that doesn't go away. And she's far from the only student who's been affected in one of these, you know, college admission scandals. It's almost like every year we get a new one. You know, just this year, there was a student at Stanford who apparently wasn't a student at all, but was living on campus in like laundry rooms and other places in and around Stanford for 7 months, pretending to be a student. Apparently no one knew. They thought, you know, this guy seems pretty smart. But this is like some of the crazy stuff that's going on in our campuses. And already at the high school level, you're seeing like sort of this like toxic behavior start to emerge, the pressure on the students to sort of achieve in the most superficial of ways. It's really not about what you want to learn, what you're interested in learning. It's about, what kind of fancy name can you get on your diploma? And I think it's really ruining some of the culture around education in America. And so that's one of the first things that really tipped me off that something was wrong with the system. And then, after I graduated from high school, I went to Georgetown University for undergrad, where I studied economics. And while I was there, another scandal happened. This was the varsity blues scandal, which you might have heard of.
Laughlin and
right, that's right.
Giuliani. I can never pronounce his last name.
Yes,
yeah,
that's right.
I got what you're saying. Yeah.
Yeah, Olivia Jade's parents. That's right.
Yeah, right.
And so, she wasn't the only one who got caught up in that whole thing. There was a girl at Georgetown whose parents, very, very wealthy people, who had bribed the tennis coach at Georgetown to the tune of, I think, like $200K to pretend that their daughter was like a world-class tennis athlete. Turned out she'd never really played competitive tennis in her life. And so she gets in, and then this whole scandal blows up. But what was weird for me was at Georgetown, in and around that time, sort of the culture of the school was people weren't so shocked that someone had used money to swing the door open. In fact, the vast majority of people, I think, felt almost like embarrassed for her because they thought that her parents had been kind of cheap to do this sort of backdoor thing instead of just bribing the development office up front, which is something you can do. I mean, so it was almost like they were looking down on her for being too poor to actually bribe the office the right way. And I remember thinking what a crazy culture that we have on this campus. I mean, can you imagine that? And, these were the types of early indicators that I had that something was really wrong with the system. And so once I graduated, I wanted to take some time off to think about a really big problem and see if I could come up with any unique insights as to why we have, such a big problem in public policy. And what I decided to focus on was higher education and why it costs so much. But very quickly, the question that I kept coming back to was sort of who's benefiting from this system and what's the market structure of higher education, and specifically, how do elite colleges sort of run this whole racket? And this eventually turned into the book, the College Cartel, that I'm going to be releasing, this January. But basically, what I found out in this whole time of doing all this research and reflecting on some of these stories is the elite colleges collude. They collude on all sorts of things. They collude on how to maximally lobby Congress to make sure that they get their tax exemptions and all sorts of subsidies. They collude on how to keep seats scarce. So this is a big one that no one's really spoken about. But, over the last 40, 50 years, the number of applications to the elite colleges have exploded. Because it's everyone from all over the world that increasingly is applying to Harvard and Georgetown and Stanford. But the number of seats have been virtually stagnant. I think at Yale, they've gone up by 67 slots, and the number of applications has gone up way more than that. And now we're at a point where some of these elite colleges don't even publish their admission rate because it's so close to zero. It's sometimes 3%, 2%. It's crazy numbers. And again, it's not about actually educating students. It's about turning students away. And the reason they want to turn students away is I allege, this sort of cartel structure. The more scarce they can make all of their schools together and the less competition there is in this elite college market, the more they can charge, the more they can sort of blackmail rich people for these donations, the types of things that people felt in Varsity Blues weren't paid. And so there's one interpretation of Varsity Blues, which is, it's great that the government decided to prosecute some of this bribery, but really what they did is they created a stronger incentive to donate more to the school. And so even richer people now have an easier time opening up slots. And all of these things, I think are deeply, deeply troubling and aren't remarked upon enough. I mean, one of the big things in the book is how elite colleges fix prices. So, if you know the history of antitrust at all, this is the one thing you can't do is you can't fix prices.
The prices, yeah.
Right. And so what the schools do is, they're very clever. What they do is they won't fix prices on the sticker price. What they'll do is they'll fix the amount of financial aid they'll offer any given student. And so they'll come together to calculate aid in the exact same way. They have a common formula, what they call a consensus methodology. And so the net price obviously is sticker minus the amount of financial aid you get. So if you collude on financial aid, you're colluding on the net price. But it's sort of like a backdoor way to do it. And this is what the schools do. So now there's a lawsuit that was just filed earlier this year, asking for, I think it's going to be over $1 billion in damages from the schools because they've been colluding in this way. And who's getting hurt? It's middle and working class students who would have gotten more financial aid in a competitive system. And so in all of these ways, the schools are not charities. They get these nonprofit designations, they get these massive subsidies. When the presidents of the schools want to go to Congress to lobby for this or that, the senators open the door wide open because they want to get their kids in too. But no one's really benefiting from the system apart from the schools. It's not rich people. Some of them, like the Varsity Blues rich people, went to jail. And the others who don't pay way more than any degree could ever be worth. It's not smart students, like the girl in my high school. She's a very clever girl. I mean, she was destroyed by the amount of pressure that's building from the scarcity of seats at the schools. And it's not, working in middle class students because they're getting ripped off on pricing. So who is really benefiting? It's the schools. And, the one stat that really sticks out for me is the endowments at the elite colleges, were double digit billions 20 years ago. I think today it's something like in aggregate 250 billion at the top 5 schools. I mean, that's a crazy amount of money. That's bigger than the GDP of many countries. And, this is how they've amassed that fortune.
How did this become your passion? Most people would just go to school and, go along with the program. It looks like, you're doing pretty good in school and everything like that. Like, how did this become your passion or something that you wanted to expose?
It's interesting. Like I said, I would be the last person to speak out against education. I was always taught, it's such an important thing to go and educate yourself. But I think that's the reason why this whole system, the more I've reflected on it, has sort of rubbed me so wrongly. Is it conflicts so much with my image of what education should and can be in this country and has been historically. The schools weren't so greedy a generation, 2 generations ago. If you look at sort of like the price of tuition, it only really took off, something like 30, 40 years ago. And I think this is a big part of the story why. Because when the elite colleges, do all of this collusion, set prices so high, and fix prices and fix seats, what ends up affecting everyone. Because again, you have to remember, if you're a UVA or a public college like Berkeley or Michigan, you're competing with probably, Cornell or Dartmouth or Penn for school. And if you're Virginia Tech, you're competing with UVA. And then if you're JMU, you're competing with Virginia Tech. And it goes all the way down. And so, the more screwed up the top of the system is, all of that ends up trickling down all the way through the bottom because the rankings, everything else is sort of like designed to make schools want to emulate the top schools. And, so that's how you end up with, something that's really dysfunctional at the top, affecting all sorts of students all across America, even students who just want to go to public colleges, who just want to get ahead, who don't care for all the prestige. They're still being affected because those schools are charging way more than they should, are spending way more than they should because they're trying to keep up with the next level. And so this is a really broken system.
I was going to say, with these slots being like purchased pretty much, like how did you feel going into school? I mean, did you feel like these people were deserving to be there? Or, I mean, did you feel that you were in the room with these intelligent people or,
Yeah. So, I think that's a really interesting question. I think it's a bit of a mixed bag. I think they're incredibly brilliant people at all of these schools. The professors are brilliant. I think there's a lot that the schools have to offer to the world. My critique isn't that people shouldn't go to the elite colleges. I think that's a critique some people make. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that more people should be able to get in and the price should be way cheaper. And the reason both of those things aren't true is because of the way they've sort of structured this market. So I would encourage, everyone who can get in to get in, and then when on campus, try to agitate to change some of these policies, because that's the only way you're gonna open up some of these campuses.
I was more so asking the question, like, you worked hard to get where you were, but somebody else purchased to get a slot. My question was more so, did you feel like, the person that purchased to get a slot, were they not,
worthy of being there?
Worthy of being there or not?
Such a term, not worthy of being in that particular position that you worked so hard to get into?
Yeah, I mean, look, I hear what you're saying. Yeah, I guess, my answer would be, obviously instinctually no. And it's not because there's anything wrong with that person, probably.
Oh, no.
In most situations, it's like the parents who have pressured this kid into going to the school because they want to brag to the other parent. But the reason I think, that they probably shouldn't be there is because, I've seen so many really qualified, hardworking students,
Right. That's what I was getting at.
who deserve that spot. And so it's not just, even if we got rid of all the kids who purchase seats at the elite colleges, it's still not enough. We should be thinking about doubling, tripling, quadrupling the seats at the schools. And that's what a natural market would produce. If they weren't colluding, you'd have 5x the number of seats. So that's how I think you really open up access to the schools. And that's why I think we need to be thinking about schools as a cartel. Because, if we were in like the 1900s, what would Teddy Roosevelt do? What would FDR do? They'd crack these schools wide open. And I think that's the type of thing we need to be thinking about. When it comes to the elite colleges.
I'm glad you brought that up because I wanted to ask you, what does the restructuring look like in your eyes? If the change was able to just be made tomorrow, what would the restructuring for you look like?
Yeah, so I can start with like the most surface level stuff, and then some of the stuff I think probably should happen on a deeper level. Okay. But so the surface level stuff is like, so let's ban price fixing first and foremost. Mm-hmm. I think like that's a fairly obvious one. And in every other market it is banned. The schools are special because they lobbied Congress to get a special antitrust exemption for themselves. And so, let's never bring that antitrust exemption back, number one. Number two, I think the federal government needs to really step in and break up this rankings collusion. So the elite colleges have an undue amount of influence over the U.S. News and World Report. And what they do is they use that influence to have the U.S. News and World Report basically, create this formula that benefits the elite college. Basically, it rewards what already exists. And what already exists is spending as much money as possible on as few students as possible. And so, if everyone's trying to do that, then again, naturally, you're going to end up with a cartel situation where no one's trying to expand supply to steal away market share from their competitors because you're graded on how few students you accept, not how many. And so, that's a place where the government can intervene immediately. The cheapest way to do that would just be to buy U.S. News and World Report, cost you $100 million. And you could change basically all of higher education just by tweaking that formula. I don't know if they will do that, but nationalizing that is something I'd look seriously at. And then I think more structurally, breaking up some of these endowments. So if you go back, maybe like 3-4 generations, there was a whole batch of schools that were seeded. Stanford, Vanderbilt, U Chicago, Carnegie Mellon. All of these schools were seeded by, these sort of like their generation's billionaire philanthropists. And yet, since then, we haven't really seen a new college startup. I don't know if you've seen like a new elite college. I think the last one was like Caltech in like 1900 or something. Right. And so for whatever reason, no one's trying to enter and compete in these markets. But what I think could happen is if we broke up the endowments, like let's say, Harvard has, I don't know, something like 55 billion. If you break that up into 5 pieces, that's $10 billion for a school. And you could have 5 Harvard and you basically put that endowment in a fund and have them build a new campus. And I think this is something we don't do enough of in America anymore is we don't have, enough new things being built, new institutions to replace the old. Things are sort of stagnating and atrophying. In a way that's really, really bad because it's not opening up more seats, more slots, more opportunities for more people. And that's no way to run a democracy. So I think breaking up the endowments, seeding new schools. You could seed maybe another 25 really great schools or, transfer that money to schools that already exist, and really give them the resources they need to be a top tier school. And the important thing here is, Harvard can run perfectly well on a $10 billion endowment. That's still massive. Right, like Columbia today has like an $11 or $12 billion endowment. So it's like you can be an incredibly wealthy school with that much money. There's no reason for that extra 40 billion. So those are some of the things I would be looking at. Yeah,
like maybe perhaps satellite schools.
Right.
I like the idea of you saying like investing into smaller schools, maybe community colleges that might bear the name Harvard or whatever the case is. And if you enter the name, I know like a lot of the big arguments you might hear from universities or even community colleges are that we are taking classes for things that we're probably never going to use in the profession that we're choosing to go in.
That's right.
So it's like you're spending money unnecessarily when you're core just to get to the core. It's like I have to cut through a few pieces of things just to get to the core of it. And I haven't really begun to start paying until I got to the core of whatever it is that I'm trying to do. So Do you feel like eliminating some of the things that we don't need would be a way to kind of free up funds to,
Carl, I couldn't agree with you more. I think one of the things that I hear all the time, and one of the things that I really remarked on in the book is why has education been so stagnant for so long?
Right.
So if you think about it, when my grandfather went to school, yeah, I mean, maybe, his the designs and stuff of the school were a little bit different. Furniture was a little bit different. But generally, the teaching instruction method was basically the same. You had a whiteboard or a blackboard. You had a teacher lecturing. You had homework and exams. And nothing has changed in the better part of 100 years, right? We're still stuck on that model. And I think one of the reasons things don't change is because no one's experimenting. It's sort of what you're saying, right? Is we're teaching the same old things that people, in some cases don't ever use. But even if they're not going to use it, at least we should be trying to take risks and develop new curriculum, new subjects, new ways of thinking about the world. And it doesn't happen anymore. I mean, if you want to ask really big or interesting questions, basically at universities today, you have to go and join a PhD program. And then once you've finished your PhD program, you have to get on the tenure track. And then you have to publish for 10 years before you get tenure. And by the time anyone's given you any ability to ask interesting questions and the resources to actually pursue them, you've been so conformist that you're too old to come up with anything really original or new. I mean, you're basically bought into whatever they thought a generation ago. And I think this is one of the problems that we have is there's not enough new thinking. There's not enough ambition an opportunity for young people to really, carve out a niche for themselves. And I think, again, a lot of it has to do with the way the schools collude to make each other more like each other. So the U.S. News and World Report formula, and I hate to keep beating a dead horse, but this is actually a really key part of this, right? So if you're going to grade each school based on this set of criteria, well, they're all going to start to look more and more like that criteria. There's a famous Charlie Munger quote, "Show me the incentive and I'll show you the outcome." This is the incentive and this is the outcome we're seeing. I mean, the schools are basically Xerox copies of each other. Maybe there's, some slight differences in geography and in branding, but essentially it's the same stuff.
Now, just something, a thought that occurred to me was when the pandemic hit, and you've seen a lot of these, which I found kind of strange, Sahaj, is that a lot of the elite schools were the ones that already had the plan in place before it trickled down to even elementary school. A lot of those guys went home early. They already had the thing set up and all. How did this affect any of the enrollment for a lot of the prestigious schools? Because I know after things kind of settled down, people felt like their education was cheated and they felt like, well, look, I'm owed something for this. I know it's a complete thing from the College Cartel book, but it's just a thought if we discuss a college. And I always wondered, with those particular elite schools, how did that pandemic affect that? Did the enrollment still become lower or no?
Yeah. So it's interesting, because of the pandemic. And so there are actually I think 2 or 3 stories here with the pandemic. And so the first, I think, is about, again, this sort of cartel monopoly story, which is the schools are so powerful. People are so desperate for those seats. They can do basically whatever they want. So when the pandemic hit, without asking anyone, without issuing any refunds, they just moved it online. People were getting a way worse education over Zoom back when, Zoom was so buggy. And generally, the schools weren't really well set up to actually execute on this. A lot of things got lost in translation. And most importantly, they didn't ask the students are you okay doing this? Would you rather a refund or you're taking a semester off? They just did it and they kept the money. And the reason they could do that is because they knew no one's going to do anything. Who are they going to go to? We have so much power in our market. And so when you empower these monopolies in this way, then they start to degrade quality over time. And that's what I think has happened at the elite colleges. And you saw that especially during the pandemic. I think the second thing is, what's interesting to me about the pandemic is for a period of a year or 2 years, you could get the same education actually being enrolled at an MIT or Yale or whatever that you could on YouTube, basically. All of those lectures more or less are online.
Right.
If you're a self-motivated student, you could get almost the exact same education that you were getting from the universities online, because they were online too. And, one of the things I write about in the book is you think about some of the great Americans of the past, someone like Abraham Lincoln, and he was self-taught. He didn't go to law school. He borrowed some books from a neighbor and he sat in the back of a barn and figured it out for himself. And so now imagine what Abraham Lincoln would be able to do with YouTube and with Google. But increasingly, there are less people that are self-taught today than there were in the 1800s. So what explains that? I mean, it's gotten so much easier than it was then, and yet way less people are doing it. And, you know, what I sort of remark upon in the book is basically the whole value of the degrees today is about signaling. You know, no one really cares if you actually have the skill. They just want to know that you have the name on the degree, that you went through that 4 years. Mm-hmm. And it's all about, you know, sort of proving and status and prestige. And it's very little about skills. And, you know, maybe some of it is natural. Maybe, you know, it's hard for employers to know who's lying and who's not on a resume. And so schools are a way to filter people. Maybe. But I think, like, you know, employers, governments, the military, everyone could be doing a way better job at trying to promote, you know, self-taught people. And I think that's a real area that we need to be pushing the education system into. Because imagine how much you could cut costs if you didn't have to force everyone to learn the exact same way. They could learn how they want at their own pace. As long as they know how to do the work, they should be certified. You know, some of the greatest lawyers in American history, Abraham Lincoln, Huey Long, I mean, all of these people are self-taught. You know, they didn't even have law school in a lot of those cases. And so it's crazy to me that now, instead of, you know, sort of emulating that, what we're saying is go get a 4-year degree, take on a ton of debt, then go to law school for 3 years, take on a ton of debt, and then we'll credential you and you can do whatever. And most of the time, you know, people aren't using any of that undergraduate education in their professional work. They're using some of maybe that law school education in their professional work. It makes no sense.
So this restructuring process that you guys are talking about, do you feel like it's a dream, or is it like an actual possibility? Because I'm looking at it from the position of I think that, you know, these universities just like the way things are. You know, they like their name. It's just like I'm just using it like a clothing brand, like Gucci. Like right. Gucci is Gucci right. because everybody can afford Gucci. You know what I mean? So I right. think that's just the way these universities kind of look at themselves the same way.
Right. And so I think that's right. That's how they are now. But I think the important question to ask is sort of two questions. One, is that what they always were? And then two, is that what they always have to? And I would say, even looking backwards, that's not what they always were. You know, there's a period in American history where Harvard and Yale used to compete to be the biggest school in the country. And they were trying to take in as many students as possible. And then, you know, something switched around 1970s and 1980s. You know, this sort of like rankings mania went crazy, and the collusive cartel started to form. And that's when the College Cartel really dug its heels in, put its roots in, and that tree of wealth started to blossom. But it sucked all the nutrients out of the American soil. And so I think, you know, that's something we really need to reverse. And so that brings me to the second question: is this how it always has to be? I think if we get really serious about reforming education, and unfortunately, up till this point, no one has gotten really serious about reforming higher education. You know, even President Biden, who I think has done more than most presidents, you know, his bailout is fine. You know, canceling and pausing student debt, I think, is an important step. But until you fix the schools, that debt's going to come back for the next generation. You know, it's not going to get any cheaper. So, yeah, you've helped out the students who were trapped before, but you're doing nothing for the next generation of students. And when you're not president and someone else is, maybe they won't write that debt off. And so, you know, I think we're at a very pivotal moment. If we don't start getting serious about reforming the system now, things could really spiral out of control. Because the other thing that's happened is, because President Biden has written off so much debt, you know, right. Schools think now, okay, well, why don't we jack up prices even more? Students will take on the debt because they'll think that the government will bail them out. And so we could see a crazy bubble emerge that's even worse than the one that we just got out of. And so I think it's so important to break up these cartels, you know, open up the schools, open up seats, open up competition. Because what happens is, when it's actually competitive, there are incentives for the schools to get cheaper, to figure out efficiency, to not waste, you know, the millions of dollars on the lazy river and all of these other things on that gym that no one uses, and all these things that look good, and they do because they have the money and they need to spend it, but actually have no impact on education whatsoever. And so I think that's the only way we can fix this. We have to start now.
What do you see education looking like for these elite colleges within the next 5-10 years from now? Do you think that these changes will be implemented to the point, or do you think that people will actually just lose interest in obtaining those names from these Ivy League colleges? Because one thing the pandemic has taught everyone to be is creative and to hone whatever skills that they have. So some people are even thinking, I don't even really need college in any form or fashion, or I'll just take up a trade, which is, as you see, is now more prevalent than having Harvard behind your name. So do you think that, the $60,000, $70,000 a semester schools will go the way of the dodo within maybe the next few years or so, if the enrollment doesn't continue to go?
So I'll make a couple points. I think what's more likely to happen. I agree with you that the pandemic has had a lot of people questioning, education broadly and sort of like what kind of skills can they self-learn. So more and more people have gotten into creating content and doing other types of things, gig work, sort of like moving to other countries. All of these like really creative things, I think, is really unique to this generation of Americans. But what's actually happened in terms of colleges is there have never been more applications to the elite colleges. What's happened is, a lot of people at sort of like the middling colleges have sort of pulled out from the system. And I think that's, depending on how things work out for them, I think that's not the worst thing in the world. But the elite colleges have actually gotten even more intense. And, I don't think it's possible that everyone withdraws from higher education generally and these institutions generally. Because I think there is still a lot of value that the institutions do provide, right? I mean, like I said, if you want to be a doctor, if you want to be a lawyer, if you want to work on Wall Street, if you want to do any of these like credentialed professions, you basically have to go through the schools. And there are only so many content creators that can survive on YouTube, right? Like attention is sort of zero sum. And so obviously best of luck to anyone who tries to do stuff like that. I think that's awesome. But, we'll always need more doctors than people on YouTube. And unless you go through these pipelines, in a lot of cases, those opportunities get foreclosed to you, which is why I think it's still super important to reform the colleges. And I think the most problematic part of the colleges is the elite college cartel.
And it's funny because you see more people studying abroad now because from my understanding, it's a little bit easier than staying in the States and trying to obtain the same thing. But you also see the reverse effect of that, where you see a lot of people from other countries coming into, the Columbias, the NYUs, the things like that. Do you think that has like a larger impact? Because, it's a difference between taking funds from someone who's not in state than it is from taking funds out of state. And it's so do you see more like the in-state students? Well, it's the college elite. So, I mean, if they have the money to go, they're going to go.
Yeah. Basically what's happening is, okay, so I'm from Virginia. I think UVA is a really interesting example, right? So UVA is sort of one of these schools. It's a very prestigious school, but it's also a public school. And so, the in-state tuition is fairly reasonable for students from Virginia. And every year, maybe like 2/3 of the class is, students from Virginia. The issue is, it used to be way more than that. What's happened basically is our middle class students, like you sort of alluded to, are now going to, other countries where the education is cheaper. And so they're trying to go to the UK and to France and to, in some cases, China and more third world countries, even in India and places like that. And the wealthiest people from all of those countries are coming and taking up seats at UVA and crowding out in-state students. And so what's happened is we've done the exact reverse of what we ought to be doing. If you think about like who UVA should have loyalty to, well, it should be the taxpayer in Virginia who's lifted that school up on his shoulders for the better part of 2 centuries. And now that they're trying to get their kid in, they can't. But when some rich guy from China wants to get his kid in, or, some billionaire from Europe wants to get his kid in, door swings wide open. And I think that's a tremendous betrayal of the American taxpayer. I think all of these schools are doing that. Even if you think about like UVA is a public school, but even if you think about like the most private school, like a place like Harvard or Penn, the amount of subsidies and tax breaks these schools get from the American government is insane. The Ivy League, I think like over the course of 1 decade, got something like $15-20 billion in research subsidies. Wow. I mean, it is a tremendous amount of money. And, these are basically quasi-public institutions. They should feel an obligation to the American taxpayer for all of that money and all of those resources. And yet they don't, I mean, they basically do everything they can to keep Americans out and foreign billionaires in.
Yes, to attack the system is to kind of attack even the political system that backs it. You know,
Mm-hmm.
how does that work? Like, I mean, we can talk about the schools all day because we're talking about institutions, but what about the people that's behind that? Because it's not, you know, elite schools for just no reason. I'm pretty sure that when, you know, if let's say hypothetically speaking, if I'm some senator's son who's a goofball pretty much, but I'm willing to pay millions of dollars to let my goofball son, you know, go to the school, I got to have a plan in mind for this kid, not to get this degree just to work. But do you think that sometimes this is done to set them up in positions of political power to say, well, that's a Harvard man, so it's okay for him to run for Senate or something like that, you know?
I think that's a big part of it, right? I mean, if you think about like, in the UK, it's sort of like Oxford and Cambridge, and all their politicians basically come from two schools.
Right.
If you look at the US Supreme Court, all the justices basically come from like, two or three schools. If you look at the US Senate, it's a lot of Ivy League and elite college people. And I think most importantly, what really sucks about all of this is when the seats get taken away from, we were talking about this earlier, sort of like these rich kids buy their way in, their parents sort of like, open the door for them. What they're really doing is taking a seat away from a hardworking student.
Mm-hmm.
And so the thought experiment I always propose is, if President Obama hadn't gone to Harvard Law, would it have been possible for him to have been elected president?
Mm-hmm.
And again, I think this speaks terribly to our society that we would have judged him very differently. But if he'd gone to Howard instead of Harvard, I think, people would have thought of him very different. People would have thought of him very differently.
Right.
I think that's an indictment of our society, but it's also a practical reality. If people want to move up in the world, people of color especially, women, minorities, people, first generation college students, they basically have to go get that hyper prestigious credential to sort of beat back the bias they might face because of other characteristics. And there's study after study that proves this, right? So like if George W. Bush goes to Yale, and he did, and then gets a Harvard MBA, it doesn't really change his trajectory. His dad was vice president and then president. He already knew everyone, he would have been fine regardless. But if President Obama gets to go to Harvard, it completely changes his trajectory. It opens up doors that would never have been open to someone like him in the past. And I think what we need to be thinking about is, how do we get more Barack Obamas into Harvard and Columbia and Stanford? Because imagine what a different country this would be if that's what we were doing. And so just one more point to your early point about, how do we actually like tackle the political challenge of this? I think it's fairly straightforward. I think young people, first of all, have to like start talking about this college cartel issue. Because I think until we do, this isn't really going to change. But I think number two, I think you saw in this midterms how important the young vote is, but for voters under 30, the Democrats get swamped in this midterm election. I think it was like a plus 30 Democrat, demographic. And so, it's time, I think, for the Democratic Party to either put up or shut up, either come up with an agenda and platform that actually does something on some of these fundamental issues, especially when it comes to monopoly, right? Like, big pharma, big tech, big education. I mean, these are things that are broadly popular with the American public to take on, these sort of like really greedy institutions. They're not creating anything of value. They're just like sucking resources, out of all of these communities. And so I think those are the things that the Democratic Party really needs to focus on. And I think young people have a tremendous position of leverage, to actually force them to do that. And the last thing I'd recommend is, if there are any young people who are interested in politics listening to this, run for office. I think, that's probably the number one way you can exert some leverage.
The funny thing is, I just don't think that there's like a real desire to crack down on this process, because, it's so funny that, like, take any university, like, these prestigious basketball universities,
right,
and for like maybe 15, 20 guys on a team, the NCAA goes through it with a fine tooth comb to find out whether or not, you got $200 from a booster or something like that. But, but you can actually, spend $1 million to get your daughter into college.
Brooklyn, I think you're completely spot on about the NCAA thing. I think this is, again, another example of the sort of like cartel behavior, right? I mean, the schools collude not to pay student athletes. That's a collusive bargain. They've all agreed we're not going to pay them beyond, tuition. And meanwhile, they're making millions and millions and millions of dollars per student, on NCAA basketball, on all of these other sports too. In a lot of cases, sponsorships, all the revenue that's coming in, especially, football and basketball are the big money makers. But again, it's complete collusion. What are they doing? They're stripping wages off of workers by colluding. It's like sort of the mirror image of monopoly is monopsony, where there's a one really powerful buyer, and that's what they're doing. They're the buyer for sort of these student athletes, and they're stripping them of wages. Again, this is the type of thing that needs to be made illegal, and actually is illegal under the laws, but for all of these exemptions that they've written into the code. Those are the places I would start, and I think that's where we need to make as much noise as possible. I think student athletes are starting to do that, which is a trend I'm really excited about.
That was my question. With everything that you just explained, it seems like all that activity would be illegal. So what actually can be done to compel these institutions to change? Yeah.
So I think there are a couple of things. Number one, I think lawsuits have a huge impact on the college system. And so in the case of basketball players, I think there was a big case before the Supreme Court, NCAA versus Alston, which was decided for the first time. The Supreme Court, I think, affirmatively recognized that schools should not be stiffing basketball players at these schools who are bringing in a tremendous, often billions of dollars of revenue for the whole system, but not getting paid. And so I think that they struck that down. Now, I think that's a small example of progress. I think we need to be doing way more, but it shows that the legal avenue is a pathway to change. And so in that particular case, I think they sued under the Sherman Act, which is one of our oldest antitrust laws. And I think that, there are probably 5, 6, 7, 8 antitrust cases I can think of off the top of my head that I wrote into the book, starting with the price fixing case that was just brought earlier this year, another one on seat scarcity, another one on bundling and tying, another one on collusion on rankings. I mean, all of these things can be challenged in the legal system and ought to be challenged in the legal system. But what's happened is, for the better part of 30, 40 years, antitrust law has sort of atrophied. And the reason that's happened is because, when President Reagan was elected, going back to him, he appointed a bunch of judges who sort of took a very conservative approach to antitrust, which is sort of, kind of a hands-off the economy approach. But what that basically allowed is for one or two firms, or in this case, a cartel of firms, to get super powerful and do all of this stuff that is so exploitive. And you see it in all sorts of other sectors. You can see it, maybe with Apple, and the 30% fee they charge to every app that's trying to get into it. You could sort of see it with Amazon, and Walmart, and the way they sort of squeeze their suppliers. You can sort of see it with Google and how, they copy other people like Yelp, and downrank their results so that they can uprank their competing products. In almost every single sector, you're seeing more and more monopolization, more and more monopoly power. And I think, what this generation ought to be looking to do is how do we bring these antitrust laws back, and how do we make them stronger? So I think some of that has to do with just bringing cases, even if you're unlikely to win, just to keep the issue alive. But I think a lot of it has to do with really smart lawyering, like the NCAA and Alston case, where, they took it all the way to the Supreme Court and they won. And I think they changed the law for the better by doing that. I think that's what we need to be looking at doing.
It's kind of sad because, I kind of get frustrated with it. I mean, this is going to go completely off the cuff, but, it seems like monopoly in any industry right now is like the wave of the future. We're from New York originally, from Brooklyn. And I remember, just having mom and pop stores and everything like that. And it seems like nothing is mom and pop no more. It's like Starbucks is on the worst corner in New York now, and Chick-fil-A is at where the old Spanish restaurant used to be, So I just think that's just the wave of the future, monopoly. And I don't know, hopefully this generation is the generation that can fight it, because I'm not too optimistic about it. That's just me. I'm old, so I'm older than you. So, I'm not too optimistic about it.
So here's what I will say. I think you're absolutely right. I think in almost every single sector, and I think you're right to point at retail, we've basically let these big chains monopolize everything. So whether it's Walmart or Chick-fil-A or McDonald's or the franchises, and what happens basically is a lot of times their strategy is to lose money by keeping things cheap, until they reach a certain really big size. And then what they do is, instead of jacking up prices on consumers, which they also do, they also start to squeeze their suppliers to get more and more money for less and less. And so what's happened, I think, a big story in America is why have, like the non-big cities become so desolate? Why have the farmlands been ravaged? Why have the farmers basically gone bankrupt? And this is a big part of the reason, because you have these massive buyers, people like Walmart and the grocery chains, people like McDonald's, who buy up a tremendous amount of meat or corn or whatever, and they just squeeze the suppliers for the cheapest possible price until the point where the farmers can't even make any money, and they don't have anyone else to sell to, right? Because, you've gotten so much scale into this system. And so this is a big story. And it's not, people try to pass it off as, these are efficiencies of scale or something like that. These are not efficiencies of scale. There's exploitation. Efficiencies of scale is coming up with new and interesting technology that lets you do more with less. That's not what they're doing. All they're basically doing is blackmail, because they have so much scale and they can kill you. And, a lot of the American economy has sort of gone in that direction. College is one of them. And I think all of those places is where we need to be thinking about, well, how do we break this up? And, the one point of hope I'd maybe mention, Brooklyn, is, things used to be much worse in America. Back when, the railroads were new, everyone thought monopoly was going to be the wave of the future. And that's when you had Standard Oil and John Rockefeller and Vanderbilt and all of these, goons, who monopolized all these industries. But then Teddy Roosevelt came and fought back. The American public came and fought back. It culminated with FDR and, the Second New Deal, and where we broke up all of these crazy monopolies. Standard Oil was ripped into a million different pieces. AT&T in '84 was broken up. IBM was broken up. This is something we've done before. We know how to do it. It's just our muscles have atrophied because, for too long, we've sort of forgotten that this is something that we can do. And, that's sort of the message that I'm hoping will resonate with people in this book is how do we bring this stuff back?
Hopefully the book will spark something in somebody to say, let's go ahead and do this.
So I'll tell you a story. And this is actually one of the things that inspired me to write the book.
Let me just say this first. You're a unicorn, bro.
There's very few people that want to buck the system these days.
Go ahead. I'm sorry. I didn't mean that to.
No, of course. Okay. Well, let me tell you a story about 7 others. I think in 2020, when the pandemic first started, there were a couple of students at Columbia, undergrads, who decided to organize a bunch of other students into what they called a tuition strike. And so these 7 students, texted and called basically all of their peers. They would hang outside. They would bother people. They printed out flyers. They tried to sign up as many people as possible. And, just 7 people basically had over 1,000 people sign up for this tuition strike, which on a small campus like Columbia is a massive amount of students. It's almost like a 6th or a 5th of the class. And all these students are basically saying, we're not going to pay tuition unless you increase financial aid by 10%. Now, in the end, those students lost that fight. And the reason they lost that fight is because the demographics at Columbia are such that once they got to 1,000 students, getting to 2,000 was very difficult, because after you got to 1,000, basically it was all just the rich kids left. And they didn't really care if financial aid went up by 10% or not. Like, it just didn't affect them. So, maybe they'd sign on, but they weren't getting enthusiastic about it. And so the momentum of the strike really died out. But what I thought was really inspiring about it is, they failed, but they brought a ton of attention to this campus about that financial aid issue. And I think, those are the types of people and those are the types of movement that, slowly but surely start to build momentum. Today at Columbia, there's a big lawsuit against the school for lying to the rankings about a wide variety of things and sort of tricking students into paying. I don't think any of those things would be happening on this campus, but for maybe that strike, which inspired people to get more critical about the school. I think things are changing, and you're sort of seeing it with Amazon and some of these other monopolies too. There are bills in Congress to fight big tech. And in Amazon's case in particular, people are unionizing for the first time in generations. You're seeing a lot of people unionize at Starbucks. And so I think things are changing. There are reasons to be hopeful. But again, one of the things that I would always caution is, history doesn't work on its own. There's no crystal ball that can predict the future. If you want a certain outcome, I think you have to get out and get involved in it. And try and make it happen. And that's the only real way to sort of to be the master of your own destiny.
Columbia, studying law.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So I can take it that you're going to be the first one to take that class action lawsuit against You're going to bring down the cartel.
I'm coming for the cartel.
The Elliott Master of Education. That's what he is, fellas. Right. The Elliott Master of Education.
Oh, we never asked him about the Yale protest.
Oh yeah. What
happened with that, man?
Oh yeah, talk about it. Yale
Well,
protest.
okay, there's a fun story. So, in May of this year, myself, some of my friends, went to Yale's graduation to protest their price fixing. And so I mentioned earlier that there's a class action lawsuit against 17 elite colleges: Yale, Columbia, Georgetown, Cornell, Duke, U Chicago, Johns Hopkins, for fixing price. And Yale was sort of like the wealthiest school in that group. Yale has something like $44 billion in their endowment. Like I mentioned, they have like 13,000 students, undergrad, something like that, per class. And, they don't need to do this, right? You don't need to steal, man. Like, it would be like Jeff Bezos stealing someone's car or something. It's like, it doesn't make any sense.
Right.
Yeah, right.
They're doing it anyway. And so, what we decided to do is we dressed up as Monopoly men, and we went to their graduation to respectfully protest and try to bring some attention to this issue. Because again, very few people know about this price fixing stuff because of the sneaky backdoor way in which they do it, which is by focusing on financial aid. And, college pricing is super opaque. A lot of people don't know about it. And so what was really interesting is, one of the things that we're planning on doing is bringing like this sort of like kind of big blimp and flying it over their graduation. And it said, Yale, stop fixing prices. And so the day before the protest, someone from the New Haven Register, which is a local paper, called me, and they were like, "Hey, tell us a little bit about the protest." So I, told them a couple of details, and I said, and by the way, we're going to bring a blimp. And I said, but please don't tell Yale. It's meant to be a surprise. For whatever reason, maybe before or after, somehow it got leaked to Yale. And so when I arrived in New Haven the day before the protest, I had to meet with the chief of police in New Haven. I had to meet with the director of emergency management of Homeland Security, something crazy like that. I had to meet with the Parks and Recs chief. I had to meet with 7 or 8 people, even though I had all the permits, I had FAA approval for everything. And after all of this, my intuition is they came up with a completely new form that I'd never seen online, that I'd never seen on any of these websites, to basically ground our blimp. And so, it's crazy. You have a couple college students who are trying to do a protest, and the government is intervening on behalf of Yale to protect their reputation. Because obviously what had happened here was, sort of the newspaper asked Yale for comment. Yale got tipped off to the blimp. They went to, all of these people. And what's really interesting to me is the story this tells, right? It's like, when you concentrate monopoly power in these institutions, what happens is they take over the public institutions that are meant to protect the people. And that's what's happened in New Haven. New Haven is a fiefdom. Yale runs New Haven. The voters don't run New Haven anymore. And I think that's broadly true of a lot of these college towns. Unfortunately, I think, at a much higher level, that's true of the U.S. Congress, which is why you have all these exemptions and these subsidies and these tax breaks. I think, that was the first time I really figured out, like, oh, this is not just, this is a very sophisticated political player. This is this is not just an accident, that they have so much power and that they charge so much.
Yeah, that's crazy. I tell you, man, that politics is where it's at. It's, get all involved. But I do imagine that the dean of Yale probably like the dean on Animal House, probably in there, and sweating and everything.
Hey, listen,
Mr. Sharda, a blimp on my campus. But
hey, you guys needed me on the team, man. I'd have told you, man. Let's not tell nobody.
You got a sneak attack, man. Now you know.
That's right. Now you know.
How far are you within this law school thing? How long you got?
So this is my first year.
You gotta hurry up. We might need a lawyer.
Yeah, I know.
Don't enjoy yourself too much in Columbia. That little area down there is a nice place to enjoy yourself, man.
That's what's
I hung out there a lot, man.
Yeah, it's dope.
So let me ask you, the book, when is that actually?
Yeah. So the book is coming out in January.
Mm-hmm.
But there, I think 2 ways people can sort of like get connected with me and the book going forward. So the first is I started this petition where people can sort of sign it and indicate to Congress that they want to get rid of this price fixing exemption that the elite colleges have. And so if they go to www.breakthecartel.com, so that again, breakthecartel.com, you can find the petition there. You can find, I think, a couple of my tweets, maybe my Substack. And so, that's a good way to get in contact with me, and to, sort of, just indicate that to Congress that, you don't want schools getting even more statutory authority to operate like a monopoly. And so I think that's a really low effort way where people can get involved with this fight.
Okay. Excellent. And we're going to put all your information, your handles and all in the descriptions, folks. So make sure you pick up that book, The College Cartel. It's good to notice this is good information, especially handed off to those. It's just good to, to be able to have somebody that verbalize what a lot of us was probably thinking. Like, this whole thing is a setup for the utmost, man. It's just a big setup.
And something everybody's been thinking for a long time.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? About time somebody took a shot at it,
Right.
Yeah.
How do the, I'm pretty sure the university is hip to the fact that you're writing this book.
How's that working out for you?
So I'll tell you, I was, when I was applying to law school, one of my professors, really a mentor of mine, I told him about this book I was writing and what I'd been working on for the last year. And he said, look, Sahaj, I love you. If I were you, I wouldn't mention this anywhere in your application because you're not going to get in anywhere if you talk about this.
Yeah.
And I didn't take his advice. I was pretty honest that I was writing this book. Mm-hmm. Title is The College Cartel. I was maybe a little bit softer on exactly what was in it, but
right.
But I had it pretty clearly on all my applications. Mm-hmm. And my thinking at the time was, look, if they don't want to take me, they won't take me. Someone will. But I think it's way over time that people stop being afraid of these sort of monopolies and cartels. Because if everyone's sort of afraid, no one says anything, nothing's going to change. So that's sort of the decision I took, and so far they haven't been too salty, but we'll see how it goes.
All right. Well, hey, you keep us posted. You definitely you have a platform, man. Once the book comes out, and you want to come out and discuss it further,
I'd love to do that.
Yeah, please.
That'd be awesome.
Please do.
Definitely look forward to reading the book.
Yeah, definitely. All right, we thank you for having us. So, with that being said, we're going to sign off. Go pick up that book. Pick it up, all right? This man needs an army behind him. All right. So check this out, y'all. The Only One Mic podcast is available on all major platforms that you stream your podcasts on. Also, check out our Only One Mic podcast YouTube channel to catch up on the past and current episodes. Please don't forget to rate the show and subscribe. Also, if you want to get in contact with us, you can reach us via Instagram and Twitter at The Only One Mic P1, Facebook and LinkedIn at The Only One Mic Podcast, and you can email us at theonlyonemic00@gmail.com. There you can leave your comments and all. Once again, we thank you for your time, and we encourage you to speak your truth quietly and clearly and listen to others, even the dull and the ignorant, because they too have their story to tell. So until next time, please keep in mind that we never had to run from the Ku Klux Klan, so we shouldn't have to run from a black man. Peace.
Peace.